she said, and I thought this is very telling, Jordan, it just described the state of the academy. She said, when I came to Cambridge, I was expecting, she said, the motto of the Royal Society is don't take anyone's word for it. And she said, that's what she was expecting when I come to Cambridge. I was expecting to engage in rigorous discussion where all of my cherished beliefs would be challenged, and I'd come away shaken and uncomfortable, and I would think for myself, and I would be forced to rethink everything, the most important things in my life. I think she was actually studying psychology. And then she said, when I got here, it wasn't like that. When I got here, I felt that I was being coddled, and there were certain things that you couldn't question, certain things that you were just made to feel an outsider when you could question. It was a brilliant article, and really telling, because it was her own experience of what it's like for a student now compared to what it was like when I was an undergraduate, many years ago. So that's an illustration of how things can go wrong and the sorts of things we were seeing around us in the sort of summer and then the autumn of 2020. James, did you want to say anything more about that point, or we can talk more about that?
No, I mean, I think it was then, wasn't it, June, July 2020? I remember you came round for lunch around here, and we started talking about, who might be willing to sign in public a support which was required by the mechanisms of all the kind of procedural mechanisms. I think we needed 25 names, wasn't it? And I think we could come up between us. We managed to come up with 7 or 8, and then and then it took us another 8 to 10 weeks to get past the 25. I think it was September that we were starting to look promising. And in fact, I think in the end, we got quite a few more than 25 for the 3 amendments that Arif was proposing to introduce to kind of to take out the respect language and replace it with
so you needed
of tolerance.
You needed those 25 to put the amendments forward?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
so that would indicate that some people were concerned that requirement for 25 rather than just one person. And it was hard to get 25.
Yeah, it was. It's telling. It's telling that actually. There might have been 2 reasons why. One reason why it might have been because it was a trivial issue and nobody cared about it. Who cares quibbling about a few words? Mm-hmm. Another reason, which I suspect was, which turned out was the more likely explanation, was that actually a lot of people were afraid to sign something in public.
So why do you think it's not trivial? And why do you think that argument's invalid? And
the reason I thought the argument was invalid because the additional evidence that I got after the vote, because the vote actually had a very high, a lot of people bothered to vote on this, and they bothered to vote for that change. If it had been a trivial thing, nobody would have cared to vote. So that was one bit of evidence. The other bit of evidence was the testimony of the people who wrote to me or who I called up at the time. And James may have got this as well. People who were saying, look, we support this, we can see what you're doing, and we can see why it's a concern. But I just don't want to get involved in this kind of fight right now. Getting involved in this is going to be too difficult for me right now. I'm up for promotion right now.
Yeah.
I don't want to face all of these things. So
yeah, well, you practice what you become. You become what you practice. And, this is something I learned as a psychologist. And I think maybe it was part of my temperament to begin with, is like, if you put off fights, they don't get better, not usually. They usually get worse. And maybe you think, well, I'll be in a better position later. And you might be, but probably you won't. And so that notion that it's not a good time, fair enough. I hate conflict. I really hate it. I'm not built for it temperamentally. But I've learned through painful experience, I would say, and not least as a clinician, that when you see the elephant's trunk under the rug, you can infer the rest of the elephant. And it's going to get bigger as you feed it with your stupidity and your withdrawal, and you let whatever it's feeding on continue. And it's extremely dangerous. You see this reflected in ancient mythology, actually, quite nicely in many situations. You see that in the Mesopotamian creation myth, where a dragon grows in the background, essentially, that threatens to swamp everything. And that's eventually defeated by a great, Marduk, as it turns out. This is a very old idea that little things left grow in the dark and get big. And so it's not really a very good reason, and especially if your conscience is bugging you, because it's something that looks into the future and says, well, this is kind of small at the moment, but.
Yeah. No, that's right.
Yeah.
And actually, go on, James.
Well, I was just saying, I remember reading that that's a kind of Babylonian creation myth, I think, isn't it? But that sense of things just growing with a kind of gathering a momentum of their own is something that we've experienced a lot of. I think there's been some work on this in sociology. I think they call it the spiral of silence. I can't remember her name, Elizabeth Neumann or Noel Neumann, and the basic idea is that fear of isolation, social isolation, ostracism is like a huge motivating factor in a person's behavior. And
well, there's two great fears, right? That's one is being isolated and thrown out of the group because then you die, and the other is biological catastrophe. Those are the two big classes of fears that you see as a clinician.
Right. So that's the animating idea. And then the spiral starts, the monster starts to grow when some people notice that their opinions are spreading fast. And that gives them a kind of confidence to double down and express themselves more confidently. And then on the other hand, people who disagree with those opinions see that their views gaining less traction and they stay silent because of the fear of social isolation.
And then they get weaker.
They get weaker, and of course, yeah.
And a lot of these people, so go on, James.
Well, I was just going to say that, social media and those sorts of things, that obviously all the network effects from that accelerates that. And so and what happens is that people just get very bad at judging what the real spread of opinion is in a social environment. And then it's a dynamic process. It's a spiral. And so you get a spiral to the point where what is a confident minority position becomes this completely unassailable orthodoxy. And I think that's one reason why, in the case of what was started to happen in Cambridge in the summer of 2020 and leading up to the vote in December, is that what we saw was that although there was deep reluctance among colleagues who struggled to get more than 25 votes to sign in public the Arif's amendments, when it came to the vote, which crucially operated via secret ballots, so you were allowed to measure opinion by people voting from within the closet, as it were. And as soon as that mechanism was allowed to operate, you suddenly the spiral of silence just, as it were, the monster explodes.
Right. So that's really interesting procedurally as well, because these sorts of positive feedback loop phenomenon, you see those in clinical therapy too. So, for example, when people start to get depressed, then they withdraw and they stop socializing, say, and they stop engaging in the activities that bring them meaning and joy. And so that makes their depression worse. And then they're more likely to withdraw again. And, it's probably an example of something like the Pareto principle operating again, right? That things can spiral up very, very rapidly and dominate, and they can spiral down it's nonlinear on both ends. Yeah. And there's some truth to that kind of process that underlies all sorts of phenomena. So that secret ballot issue, that's really relevant for bringing something like this to a halt.
Yeah. I think, yeah. Go ahead, Arif.
Okay. No, I was going to say one part of that isolation process also, I think, is certain kinds of social interactions or professional interactions. And what I mean is the experience of being in meetings, for instance, departmental meetings or college meetings, where probably a lot of people, there'll be some mad or insane proposal, I don't know, to say we're going to remove all pronouns from our policy, or we're going to have this change to the syllabus or whatever. And everybody, or maybe most people in the room, were thinking this is nonsense, but I'm not going to say it's nonsense. And they left the meeting thinking they were the only person who thought it was nonsense. Because nobody spoke out, and the thing was not decided by a secret ballot. If it had been decided by a secret ballot, as was the case, as James says, in December, suddenly you had thousands of people realizing that they weren't alone.
It's also possible that the objections, so imagine those objections manifest themselves in people's imagination, but they're not hooked so tightly to a whole ideological network as the proposal is. And so in some sense, people don't have the right words at hand immediately. The pronoun thing is a good indication because, justify your use of he and she. It's like, I don't know how to do that exactly. That's what everyone does. We've done that forever. And that's my justification. It's like, it's pretty weak compared to that whole ideology that's coming at you. And those people who are so committed, they're often pretty verbal they're pretty well able to articulate that ideology and quite forcefully, and they're emotionally committed to it. And so that's also a structural problem.
Yeah. And they have devices. So, for instance, if you think about the way I found the way these people use terms like not only welfare, but also harm, the idea that words do harm to people, which has a lot of currency now in Britain and is chilling, is based on an absurdly inflated conception of harm. But when you're in the middle of a discussion,
it's also related to another cognitive problem, which is one of the things I often did as a therapist when someone told me they were afraid of something, doing something, is I said, well, that's because you're not afraid enough of not doing it. Yeah. Because the doing produces this harm, let's say, and you can be afraid of that. But the not doing is sort of invisible. And that has something to do with decision-making in uncertainty, by the way. And so I used to get people to flesh out what would happen if they didn't do the thing they were afraid of. And then they thought, oh, I see, there's real risk both ways. And now I get to pick my risk. And this harm issue is the same thing, because you could say, well, sometimes words do harm. There's no doubt about that. And maybe it's unfair to conflate that with something like physical violence, although you could have a discussion about that. But the question that isn't being asked then is, well, what harm does your attempt to shut down what words you regard as harmful, what's that likely to produce for harm? Well, none. It's like, oh, really? So you haven't thought that part of it through at all. And you're going to be the arbiter of what's harmful and what's not. And there's no danger in that either, is there? So that's a good way to deal with that sort of thing.
I agree. And of course, another thing that a lot of the time people don't see is they think, we can impose on people's speech, we can tell them how to behave various ways, but they don't think that that's an instrument that can be abused in all sorts of ways. So if you mandate speech on one thing one day, it's going to be mandated on other things the next day. And in general, I think with any form of coercive principle, you need to think what's going to happen in the hands of somebody wicked and tyrannical. That's how we should think about these things, not only in university, but in politics more generally.
Typical right-wing claptrap. Well, that's kind of an interesting thing, right? Because one thing that conservative thinking does always is say, yeah, but. It's like, well, you're putting this forward for the good, and fair enough, and it's based on compassion, and that's actually a virtue, although it is by no means the only virtue, and sometimes it's a vice. But why are you so sure that this will only do the thing you think it will do and nothing else, and that you're wise enough to make that change, right, in something that's sort of working already? So...
Part of the problem might be that I think it's a sort of a glitch within liberalism. When you think back to Mill's idea, the famous no harm principle, which for many, many years operated as a very, very good basic rule for governing social interaction. But you can understand the temptation of trying to fold under the notion of harm or violence. I think it's the Australian psychologist Nick Haslam calls this concept creep. You can see that the sort of the power that comes from leveraging these concepts, particularly when an institution is caught in the headlights of a Twitter mob or whatever it might be, that there's sort of threat to the harm, there's harm or threats of harm or violence to the person, which are, in the end, I think I take your point, Jordan. There may well be certain situations in which use of speech can be thought of as inflicting harm, but that is something that society and the legislature in that society needs to deliberate upon and decide. And we all accept that freedom of speech is not an unqualified right, and indeed academic freedom has proper parameters imposed as well.
Well, we could also be grown up and say that it's dangerous but necessary. It's dangerous, but necessary.
I think that the danger comes in when what counts as harm is being subjectively determined. And so this notion that started to gather steam in the last few years, this idea of a microaggression, which in effect is an aggression or a claim that harm has been inflicted on a person that is subjectively determined. That is to say, it's in principle not an offense that could be explored in any kind of forensic context by a jury or a judge. That is to say, the only evidence that of the harm that could possibly count is the subject saying, "You've hurt me." And so the danger of the language that Arif was protesting against, the identitarian respect language, is that it effectively conferred a veto on the most psychologically fragile person in the university. And who could simply say, and there would be no way of establishing whether or not they were sincere with that. They'd have to be just simply taken at face value, that this person, the invitation to this speaker troubles me, upsets me, does me harm.
Yeah, well, that's interesting too. Like, imagine you take that hypothetical sensitive person. It might not be in their best interests to actually grant them that sort of veto power, because one of the things you do with someone who's really depressed or anxious is actually, especially if you're working as a cognitive behaviorist, let's say, is you get them to look at the thoughts that are upsetting them and maybe modify the ones that are making them sensitive beyond what is good for them. And that's also, to some degree, judged subjectively by them. And so it isn't necessarily the case that protecting people in that manner and giving them that sort of power is actually in their best interest. So
it reminds me of that insight of Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff in their 2017 Atlantic article that became The Coddling of the American Mind, where one of the three principles I think Jonathan isolates is a sort of inversion of the Nietzschean idea that, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. That is to say, anything that the sort of harm or violence that sort of any kind of threat it's not something that can toughen you up. It's not an opportunity to try and strengthen your character or to develop resilience. And I think this is something you've touched on.
Well, that's also a huge part of what universities are doing for their students, if you think about it psychologically. So we could talk about people who are hypersensitive to anxiety and depression. Let's say they're higher in neuroticism. Well, one of the things you want to do when you get educated is arm yourself with defenses, and I mean practical defenses, both ideational, so the way you think and the way you act, against that kind of onslaught. And education can really do that, right? Because you're quicker on your feet and you know more. And also, if you're trying to reduce someone's anxiety and depression, and they're temperamentally tilted that way, what you actually do is gradually expose them to the things that they're afraid of. You don't protect them more and more and more, because that actually makes that positive spiral descent into depression and anxiety worse. So the idea that you should remove everything that might threaten someone's identity and you should make that a university-wide policy is actually exactly the opposite of what you should do, speaking clinically, if you're trying to help people become more resilient. This is a serious issue. Well, obviously, this is all serious.
But the fact is, universities in the UK are, to some extent, going in the opposite direction. So they do have, as James points out, this category of what are called microaggressions. And these are things which can even be a matter for disciplinary action if you're reported for it. Where you say something
at NYU, there's posters all over the place, like in the bathrooms, for example, encouraging people to report such things to the appropriate, well-paid bureaucratic authorities.
Well, Cambridge tried to introduce a system where you could report these things anonymously, so not confidentially, anonymously. Nobody knows who made the report. So it's like East Germany. The report comes in, and then somebody could, in principle, be disciplined for it.
Yeah, no one would ever misuse that.
No, you couldn't imagine that. So as you say, if making fun of someone's religion, for instance, is something I can't do, that's a kind of challenge which might upset them. And as you say, part of the point of words is to some extent that they do some harm. They're meant to be upsetting. They're meant to shake your views about things. If the conversations you have at university, never upset you, never make you feel a little bit less confident, never make you perhaps even make you cry sometimes, university isn't doing its job.